Hello, welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing this drawing of moonlight over the river in charcoal. Let's have a look. I'm going to do a sketch with a graphite pencil. I have my paper taped down to a board and the size is 9 times 12 inches. It's 190 GSM paper. My main drawing tools will be charcoal pencils and vine charcoal, but I usually do the initial sketch with a graphite pencil. There's going to be a bit of land sticking out on the right and some trees as well, and we're going to have some distant trees in the middle and on the left, and of course the moon and the cloudy night sky. I'm starting to work with a medium charcoal pencil. These are Warrison woodless charcoal pencils. This one is pretty short, but it'll do for this drawing. I'm making some suggestions of distant trees on the other side of the river. Just some suggestions of canopies on the other side. And after that I need to decide where the moon will be. And then I'm going to start shading the sky. I'm going to do this with vine charcoal. And at first it'll seem like a mess, and you normally wouldn't do this with a charcoal pencil because the charcoal pencil would produce too much texture and you could never really get rid of all of those lines, and it would be too dark anyway. But with the vine charcoal, which is natural charcoal, it's softer and it's a little bit easier to move around, so most of these lines will be blended in, and the sky will not be too dark. Even though this is a night scene, I don't want to make it too dark. I want strong moonlight. So I need to cover all of the sky with this piece of vine charcoal. And you can notice that I left a bit of white space in the middle where the moon will be. When I work in charcoal or graphite, or any other medium for that matter, I tend to reserve the whites. That's my preferred method of creating smaller areas of lighter value. Sometimes you have to use an eraser, but when I can, I like to reserve the white space by not covering it with charcoal. Now notice here that the edges of this moon are not very clean. Normally that would not be the case. You would see that sort of stuff with a sunset or something. That's why I'm going to have to clean up the edge. But that won't be too difficult to do. I'm spreading the vine charcoal around with a soft brush until I get it to look even. And once I did that, I was ready to work on the edges of the moon. So like I said, I want to create a clean edge. And first I worked around that light circle, and then I used a pencil eraser to clean it up. Now this is a Kohinoor eraser in a pencil. It's basically a soft rubber in a wood casing. It can be sharpened like a regular pencil, but you can also crop the tip so that you can create a nice clean edge, nice sharp edge that you can use to erase with some precision. If you can find a Tombow Mono Zero eraser, that also works pretty well. So you can see how I'm able to clean up this edge. And I'm really trying to make the circle look as smooth as possible. And you can see how much contrast I'm getting with the background. The moon needs to be a lot lighter than the background, obviously. The problem with the regular erasers is that they leave a little bit of residue, so you can always use a kneaded eraser to clean that up a little bit, because the kneaded eraser doesn't do that. Here I also added some details on the moon, because it's not supposed to be completely white, so we have some suggestions of some shapes or irregularities on its surface, I guess. Now I'm going to start working on the sky. I'm going to draw some clouds, and I'm going to do this with a combination of a kneaded eraser and a pencil eraser. The good thing about the kneaded eraser is that you can modify its shape, and you can kind of control how much of the charcoal you lift up. And there are basically two things you can do with a kneaded eraser. You can drag or you can dab. When you drag, you tend to clean up a little bit more and a little bit cleaner. When you dab, you can lift up, but as you dab repeatedly, the kneaded eraser lifts up or picks up some of that charcoal and puts it down back, so it's also good as a blending tool. So if you want to create some lighter areas, like for example light wispy clouds, but you don't want the edges to be very well defined, you can use that dabbing motion. And if you want to go back in and define some of the edges and some of the details, you can just remold or reshape your kneaded eraser and clean up some of those edges, or you can use that pencil eraser. Either way works fine. So I'm just kind of randomly lifting up a bit of charcoal here and there. Trying to make these clouds look as natural as possible. The thing is that I can't just have a whole bunch of these lighter circles or circle-like shapes just thrown around the moon. I have to group them a little bit so that they look like actual clouds. And I also need to try to vary the amount of value in them so that they can appear a little bit more three-dimensional and a little bit less flat. I can also clean up some of their edges so that they stand out more against the background. And I can do that with a pencil eraser, which is what I'm doing now. I don't mind that I'm creating these irregular shapes. That's kind of the point of these clouds. But like I said, I do want to try to group them a little bit with just a few of these smaller clouds kind of flying away from the rest. I'm going to dab a little bit on the right side as well, but I don't really need to do too much on that side because there's going to be some trees over there. So I'm starting to work on the other bank across the river, and first I drew a line with a medium charcoal pencil, and I'm hoping that it's level enough, and then I'm starting to work on the trees, on these canopies. And I'm doing that with vine charcoal. Vine charcoal will do here because I don't want to produce too much texture and I don't need too much value. If I wanted to create slightly darker and more detailed looking trees, I would definitely be using a medium charcoal pencil for this because the charcoal pencil will produce a lot more texture and it will be a little bit darker in value. But with the vine charcoal it's easier to create that atmospheric effect when you're looking at things at a distance, where they kind of not necessarily fade, but there is a loss in detail and contrast as you look further into the distance. So I want these trees on the other side of the river to be a little bit lighter in value. I want there to be a bit less contrast, and of course naturally I want a lot less texture because the further you look you're going to be able to see fewer details. And notice how I'm creating these irregular edges around the treetops, trying to imitate the appearance of those canopies. I don't need to define individual trees. I'm just going to make some suggestions of shapes of trees, some groups of foliage, and I'm going to cover all of this with the vine charcoal and then blend that with a brush softly. If I try doing this with a tortillon, and I will use a tortillon a little bit as well, but if I use the tortillon I would kind of push that charcoal a little bit too much into the paper and I wouldn't really be producing the effect I want to produce. I want that charcoal to sit on top of the paper for now. I don't want it pushed into the grain of the paper too much. I want to be able to move it around a little bit. And I want to be able to modify it easily. So here I'm working on the reflection because there needs to be a reflection as well. I wanted to create a smoother, lighter area on the surface of the water, so I used a bit of that grey pastel instead of the vine charcoal. I figured it would be a little bit smoother and produce a bit less texture. I could also use vine charcoal for that, for a similar effect, I guess. But this one I feel worked a little bit better. It's a little bit too light now. I will be adding some value to it. And now I'm going to add a little more value to the reflection. The reflection needs to match the image above the water roughly. It doesn't have to look like that exactly, because there's also some ripples in the water. Plus the viewer won't mind some of the approximation and simplification. So that's some initial work on the reflection. Now I'm going to draw the line of the water here to kind of separate the reflection from the objects above the surface of the water. And I did that with a sharp pencil eraser. I'm maybe going to draw some suggestions of rocks or irregularities in the terrain on the other side of the river. And I'm going to try to reflect those in the water. Another thing I need to do is kind of break up that mass of trees in the distance and try to give some more suggestions of shapes and canopies, because I want a little bit more detail in there. I can do that with a combination of tortillons and erasers. Our pencil eraser is doing a nice job, but you can also use a clean brush to lift up a little bit of vine charcoal, because vine charcoal doesn't really stick to the paper that much, so you can use a clean brush and you can just lift up a little bit of charcoal to create some suggestions of lighter tree canopies. And I'm also trying to add some lighter details in the reflection as well. You can use your finger to lift up a little bit, but that's probably a little bit too much. So you can see that I'm occasionally cleaning my brush, and as I'm putting it down on these areas which I covered with vine charcoal, I'm easily removing the vine charcoal. I'm kind of lifting it up. Vine charcoal will be easily modified and easily moved until I spray it with a fixative. And only then it'll be fixed. And you won't be able to make these modifications. But until then, you can see that I can actually use my brush as a pencil eraser. And in this case it's actually a little bit more convenient than a pencil eraser, because I have to make fewer strokes here and there to create some very natural looking trees in the distance. I'm always going back in the reflection and taking away a little bit of the value so that the reflection would match the image above the water. again with a clean brush, just dabbing a little bit and lifting up a little bit of charcoal, and you can see how I'm creating those nice suggestions of treetops which are catching some light from the moon. Very gently, it's almost like painting, but I don't really have anything on the brush. I'm just lifting up the vine charcoal. So the trees on the other side look very, very detailed and realistic, very convincing. And I didn't really have to put in too much effort to create those. But I'm going to go back in and I'm going to make some portions of this reflection a bit darker, because I felt like it didn't really match the objects above the water enough in terms of value. The other row of trees here on the right side is going to be a lot lighter, and I need to put even less detail there because those are even further back in the distance. So now we are moving on to the foreground. I'm not going to do much work with a medium charcoal pencil just yet. I'm still going to do most of the work with vine charcoal. And that's because I'm kind of trying to establish some darker tones in this foreground area. But at the same time, I'm drawing the shape of this bit of land which is kind of sticking out, and maybe some suggestions of blades of grass here in the foreground. So I'm going to draw a tree here on the right. I'm going to do that with a medium charcoal pencil because I don't want that charcoal to move once I start covering the other stuff with the vine charcoal. I want those lines to remain. That's why I used a medium charcoal pencil. I want to know where that tree will be. I'm just going to draw a few suggestions of clouds on the other side as well, but like I said, this part doesn't have to be quite as detailed because there's going to be some trees obscuring them. And a bit of reflection. And now I'm going to cover this whole area in the foreground to establish some base value, which is going to be a little bit darker than the rest of the scene. So it's one of those scenes where I'm trying to establish a nice contrast between a darker background, between a darker foreground and a lighter background. And the foreground is largely in the shadow. Cleaning my hands with a paper towel. When you're working with charcoal or with pastels, it's always a good idea to have some paper towels lying around because things can get messy when you're working in charcoal. I'm pushing a little bit of that charcoal onto this part of the water surface to make it a little bit darker, so that it kind of reflects what's going on above the water. I'm not going to draw the detailed reflection of clouds. I'm just going to draw some suggestions of areas of lighter value here and there. And I'm going to do the same thing with the reflection of the moon, just a few lighter ripples to match the reflection. And now you can see the basic shape of my scene. The composition has been fully developed in terms of the arrangement of elements and the basic distribution of values. But now I'm going to start working on some details in the foreground and adding some additional value. I'm starting to work on the grass in the foreground using a medium charcoal pencil, just using it to draw some suggestions of blades of grass here and there, but it's not going to be all grass. I want some of it to look like dirt, clumps of mud or whatever. So I'm just going to do a combination of some back and forth strokes and some circular motions to try to create an illusion of detail in that foreground. Now, why do we need more texture in the foreground? Obviously because you need more detail in the foreground, and a way to create more, and a way to create an illusion of detail or more detail in the foreground is to create more texture in the foreground. And charcoal pencil will certainly produce a lot more texture than the vine charcoal. That's why I'm going to go over the vine charcoal with a charcoal pencil, and I'm going to produce a lot of texture in the foreground. I used a pencil eraser here and there to create some lighter ripples in that water. I thought that would be a nice effect. And maybe to add some lighter areas that match the image above the water. But I grabbed that pencil, medium charcoal pencil again, and I'm continuing to work on the foreground. If you're wondering what I use for sharpening, I use mostly Faber-Castell sharpeners. I tried using Staedtlers, but they tend to work better with graphite pencils for me. I find that these Faber-Castell regular sharpeners I use just tend to be better with charcoal pencils. They sharpen the pencils to a slightly shorter tip, which makes them less difficult to break. Charcoal is a little bit brittle, it does break, and these woodless charcoal pencils are a little bit more difficult to break, but they do break occasionally. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You can see how I shaded this bit of land here. I tried to make the area which is facing away from the moon a bit darker. But at the same time, you can see that I produced a lot of texture, and that I intend to leave it like that because I want to create some suggestion of detail. I'm adding a bit more value to the surface of the water. And now I'm going to draw some more details here in the midground. Maybe some trees and some branches and some twigs and things like that. I'm going to do this with a sharp medium charcoal pencil. You can see how I'm kind of wiggling my hand a little bit to produce these irregular lines that kind of look like small trees and tree branches, which are very thin. They are kind of growing out to one another, and the thing to remember with trees is that when you're drawing branches and things like that, is that we need to try to create these irregular shapes, and at the same time you have to make them taper. So one of the ways to make them taper is to go over the base one more time, and then allow your stroke to taper towards the smaller branches and the smaller twigs, and that way you can produce some natural looking trees and bushes and branches. You need to try to make them grow all over the place. But this is just to have some details in the foreground. Because every time you put something in the foreground, you can see how it kind of pushes the objects in the background further back, and it helps you create an illusion of depth and distance. That's one of the things that I often talked about in many of my landscapes. It's important to try to create depth in your drawings, and in order to create depth, because a drawing is two-dimensional, so you don't have the same feeling as when you're looking at things in real life with your own eyes. You don't have that depth of vision. So to simulate that depth, you need to try to put some objects in front of the others, and that way our viewer can feel that distance. And you should do the same thing when you're taking photos. I think, even though I'm not a photographer, but I imagine that if you want to create a nice looking landscape, or if you want to take a picture of a nice looking landscape, you need to try to capture the depth of the scene. And you won't be able to do that with a camera, because you won't have that same feeling of depth and distance as you do when you're just standing there in the nature and looking at the scenery. So if you try to position yourself behind an object and use it as your foreground, the viewer will have a lot more of that feeling of depth and distance. And I try to use the same trick when I draw landscapes. So you kind of put stuff in the background and the midground and the foreground, and you kind of allow them to overlap. And each time you put something in the foreground which is kind of slightly covering some of the background or the midground, you're pushing the stuff in the background further back and creating more of a feeling of depth in your scene. If you can hear some noises of kids in the background, I have two small kids, and even though this room, which I'm using as my studio, is fairly isolated, there's always going to be some noise. When you have small kids, your house is never ever quiet unless they're asleep, and most of the time they're not. So that's just the way it is. I hope that it doesn't take away anything from this video. So I did some trees there which are a little bit further back, but still in front of those trees on the other side of the river. And now I'm gonna try to draw some reflections here. They need to be a little bit irregular and almost interrupted. That image needs to be irregular and interrupted because of the ripples. And I'm also using my pencil eraser here and there to create some suggestions of lighter shapes on that bit of land there, to create some suggestions of rocks and things like that. And I'm drawing some more darker ripples here to create a reflection. Like I said, even though this is a night scene, I don't want it to appear too dark. I want it a little bit lighter because of all the moonlight. Only the foreground is going to be a little bit darker. So here I'm going to draw some lighter ripples to make it look like the reflection of that moon, and also some lighter shapes to create some suggestions of reflections of those clouds. I don't need to do too much. I don't want to make a perfect reflection. Now, this larger tree here in the foreground is going to be way darker than the rest of the scene, but I also used some charcoal powder here. I just put down a bunch of charcoal powder which I created by sharpening, and I'm going to cover most of the lower part of my scene, especially on the right, with that charcoal, and my finger is going to make things a lot quicker. So this part of the foreground is going to be darker, and if I mess up some of the edges I will refine them a bit later. So I'm just using the charcoal dust and pushing it around with my finger, trying to create some suggestions of darker areas here in the foreground. Your fingers will get messy during this process, so it's a good idea to clean them up every now and then if you don't want to mess up other parts of your drawing. And now I'm going to use brushes to push that charcoal around a bit. Now, the way to preserve a clean edge when you're working with brushes is to point the tip of the brush towards the edge. And that way you're pushing the charcoal to the edge and no further. Now I'm going to rotate my drawing so that I could do the same thing on the other side of the tree trunk. I'm pushing the charcoal to that edge. Don't worry about this whole mess of charcoal powder lying around. I'll just blow it away and it won't be a problem. I'm just going to toss it here and blow it away. And now you can see it's clean. The edges don't look perfect. I'm going to clean them up a little bit, but we're getting there. It's getting better. So you can see that I've achieved a nice contrast between the darker images in the foreground and the lighter objects in the background. I'm using a tortillon to further clean up the edges, because I really want that tree to stand out. So here I also need to work on this reflection a little bit more so that it can be a little bit clearer to the viewer where this land or where this bank ends and where the reflection begins. And I'm going back with a pencil eraser here and there to create some suggestions of lighter value. I'm going to add a few more trees here in the background and maybe add some shadows to them. Shadows which are created by the moonlight. So I need a few more trees here to the right. Just to complete my scene. Your scene doesn't have to be symmetrical every single time. Sometimes you can have more stuff on one side of your drawing. Asymmetrical compositions can work. And now I'm using that medium charcoal pencil to draw some taller grass here in the foreground, and to give it a little bit more of a feeling of density and volume, I'm going over that with a brush, and that kind of makes it look thicker. So because this part of the land here is facing upwards towards the moon, it's going to be lighter, but I can also create some suggestions of areas of lighter value in that rocky bank there because I want to make it look like some bits of that land are sticking out and facing towards the light source. I'm using vine charcoal here to draw some leaves here and to complete those trees on the right. Vine charcoal is a very quick way of drawing clumps of leaves, or individual leaves for that matter. I want this part of the scene to be a little bit more detailed, but not too detailed. I don't need to draw every single leaf. And because this area here is in the foreground, I'm going to try to make it dark, not just darker but also a lot more detailed. So I'm just dragging my pencil there, varying my stroke, trying to produce some random texture that'll create an illusion of detail. Later I will use that texture and maybe add some highlights to it here and there, maybe add some suggestions of cracks or some stones or clumps of dirt, who knows. But I'm going to do that just so the foreground would appear a bit more detailed and a bit more realistic. I had to blend everything a bit more with my finger, ruining some of the texture, but I'll go back with a pencil. I still have some of the texture left, but I did that just to make sure that I have a sufficient amount of value there, because I really want that part of the land, of the bank, to be darker than the rest of the scene. And now I'm just going back with a medium charcoal pencil and drawing some clumps of grass, just some suggestions of grass in the foreground. And the scene is starting to look a lot more detailed, as you can see. Now I put my signature in the lower right corner before I spray everything with a fixative, and I used a pencil eraser to draw that signature. I thought that the lower right corner would be a good place for it. And now I need to remove that tape. The drawing has been sprayed with a fixative. Now it's not going to smudge too much, but I'm still going to wipe off my fingers a little bit before I start removing this tape. Now some people find this part of the process satisfying. I actually don't like it because it can be a little bit tricky. I just want to show you how slow this can be sometimes if you want to avoid ripping the paper. And here it is, the finished scene. It's sprayed with a fixative and the tape is removed. I think the composition looks really nice. There are some nice dark tones, some nice contrast. I hope you enjoyed this charcoal drawing of Moonlight over the river. Don't forget to check out my other videos. Don't forget to subscribe. If you want to see longer videos, check out my Patreon. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.